Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to Ukrainians around the world. Today is Tuesday, July 1st, 2025. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Our guest today is Professor Alex Szczerbiak, who is professor of politics at the University of Sussex in the UK, and he is also an analyst on the Polish political scene. Today's topic will be what will be the impact of the Polish presidential election on the situation in Ukraine. Welcome, Professor Szczerbiak. How are you?
Hello there. Yes, I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Good. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
To start off with, can we get a bit about your educational background and professional career?
Sure. Before I became an academic, I worked as a researcher in the UK Parliament for a couple of years. I worked in political PR. And then in the mid 1990s, I did my PhD at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, which is part of the University of London. And since 1998, I've been working at the University of Sussex. And as you say, my area of expertise is Polish politics, society, foreign policy, and that's because that's my background. That's where all my family comes from, and the family that's still alive all live there out in Poland.
On June 1st, 2025, there was a Polish presidential election. And in that election, the conservative historian Karol Nawrocki was elected Poland's new president, and he narrowly beat Warsaw's liberal mayor, Rafał Trzaskowski. What do you think is the implication of this presidential election for the country?
It's very problematic for the government led by Donald Tusk, the liberal centrist prime minister of the Civic Platform party. Karol Nawrocki was supported by the Law and Justice Party, the right-wing main opposition party. The president doesn't have a say in the day-to-day governance of the country, but he has some very important constitutional instruments that he can use to block the work of the government, particularly a veto, which requires a 3/5 parliamentary majority to overturn, and the government doesn't have that. And he can also refer legislation to the Constitutional Tribunal. It's a very powerful body that can strike down Polish laws. And until that tribunal considers that legislation, it doesn't come into effect. And all the members of the tribunal currently were appointed by parliaments dominated by the Law and Justice Party when it was in government previously. So it's going to make it very, very difficult for the government to get through its legislation during the rest of its parliamentary term, which runs until autumn 2027. But perhaps even more importantly, it's going to change the political dynamic because the government has faced a hostile president for the last 18 months, but Mr. Nawrocki has a mandate, and a big mandate. This was the largest turnout ever in a Polish presidential election. It's almost as large as the record turnout in the last parliamentary election. And the vote was widely interpreted, or has been widely interpreted, as a vote of no confidence in the government. That's the way that Mr. Nawrocki ran it, as a referendum, and I think that's probably a good way to interpret it. So it's going to be very difficult for the government to get through its legislative programme, but also politically it's going to be on the back foot right up until the next election, which, as I say, is scheduled in autumn 2027.
President Nawrocki has stated that he is against Ukraine's entry into the European Union at this time. Why?
Well, he has said that. He's also said he's against Ukraine joining NATO. In fact, on the latter, he's been somewhat more unequivocal. He's actually signed a statement to that effect in order to win over supporters of the candidate who finished third in the presidential election, Sławomir Mencen, which he did very successfully. What he said about Ukraine's entry into the EU is a bit more equivocal. The sort of last major statement he made about it was really in February earlier this year, and what he suggested was that Poland should use the fact that Ukraine wants to join the EU as leverage in order to settle some of the questions that are contentious between the two countries. So we've got historical questions, but also areas where Ukraine and Polish economic interests lie. So he's a bit more equivocal about Ukraine's entry into the EU. He seems to be much clearer in terms of his opposition to Ukraine joining NATO. I should say that although the current government, the Tusk government, is formally strongly in favour of Ukraine's entry into the EU and indeed has tried to use the EU presidency to push this forward, although not particularly successfully. Various members of that government, Defence Minister, for example, Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz, have also at various times said that Ukraine shouldn't join the EU until the historical issues, which are a source of controversy between Poland and Ukraine, have been resolved. So in some senses, there are similar statements that have been made by members of the government as well. But I think, Mr. Nawrocki made a much clearer pitch on this and indicated that he was very skeptical about Ukraine joining both the EU and NATO.
And so, from a foreign policy perspective, what are the main obstacles in Polish-Ukrainian relations?
I think there are two, really. I think there are historical issues. This is really about evaluations of what happened in the Polish-Ukrainian borderlands during the Second World War, and particularly the fact that in Poland, the so-called Wołyń massacre, where Polish civilians were killed by Ukrainian nationalists. The fact that Poles describe this as a genocide, and that this is a narrative that the Ukrainian government politicians are not happy to adopt. So that's a clear source of divisions, and kind of linked to that. That's obviously a historical issue about different interpretations of history and whether the Wołyń massacre was a genocide against Poles. Are also current issues to do with attempts by the Polish government for the exhumation of and reburial, a sort of proper reburial of Poles that were killed during the Wołyń massacre. So that's one issue, historical issues, which obviously for somebody like Mr. Nawrocki, who is a historian, are going to be very, very important. But there's also economic issues. And I think the most important of these is the question of agriculture. I think there is a perception among Polish farmers and Polish politicians have picked up on this narrative that they face unfair competition from Ukrainian farmers, that in allowing a passageway for Ukrainian goods, agricultural goods, to come through Poland as a result of other channels being closed off, a lot of this has found its way into the Polish and EU markets more generally, and Polish farmers, they argue, are not able to compete. They argue that the competition is unfair. So these are and this is an ongoing and very current issue of dispute. And these are the issues that Mr. Nawrocki, for example, has raised as the obstacles to Ukraine joining the EU. So these historical issues to do with the Wołyń massacre, but also these economic issues to do with what's perceived to be unfair competition by Ukrainian farmers to Polish farmers.
Does President Nawrocki support Ukraine in its war with Russia?
Absolutely. He is strongly in favor of continuing support for Ukraine in the war against Russia. He believes that Poland needs to continue to provide strong diplomatic, military, humanitarian aid to Ukraine. He believes that Poland and Ukraine have a strong common shared interest in halting Russian expansionism and therefore in Ukraine winning the war or at best in a peace settlement that is on terms that are favourable to Ukraine. I think it's worth bearing in mind there isn't really any sort of pro-Russian lobby in Poland. I mean, there are some minor politicians who are very critical of the Ukrainian government and don't believe that Poland should be particularly supportive of it. But there isn't really a sort of a pro-Putin lobby that you find in other post-communist states and indeed in other parts of Western Europe. The consensus is very much that, Poland and Ukraine have this, whatever their differences might be on other issues, historical issues, economic issues, they have a strong shared common interest in stopping Russian expansionism. And obviously the key front line, literally, in terms of that at the moment is the war in Ukraine.
Do you think Poland will change its support for Ukrainian refugees who have arrived in the country since the Russian invasion began in 2022?
I think it's already changing. And you can see this in surveys of public attitudes. I mean, there was an enormous outpouring of support, both from the government in terms of providing Ukrainians with rights to public services, to welfare benefits, to Ukrainian children, to Polish education. And also from Polish society. I mean, a lot of the Ukrainians who came over fleeing the war in 2022 actually found that a lot of the aid that was provided was actually by Polish charitable organizations, Polish individuals who in many cases actually provided accommodation for Ukrainian refugees. It's very interesting. Poland was very firm about the fact that it didn't want camps. It didn't want kind of refugee camps. It wanted refugees to be integrated into the Polish community as much as possible. And there was overwhelming support at that time for those measures. I think that has changed. I think there is much less support now for Ukrainian refugees in Poland than there was. And you can see this over a number of issues, including issues that came up in the presidential election campaign. To give you a couple of examples, welfare benefits. During the election, this was always the issue for which there was least support among Poles in terms of extending welfare benefits, exactly the same welfare benefits rights to Ukrainian refugees as Poles currently enjoy, which is what the government did. There was always some wariness about this. This enjoyed the least public support. Now, there's actually quite a lot of hostility to this. I think the feeling is that this is the point where Ukrainians, the emergency sort of passed in a sense, and now the Ukrainians who've been living in Poland for a couple of years now should really be integrating and contributing to the Polish economy rather than drawing upon welfare benefits. And it's interesting that Mr. Nawrocki's liberal opponent, Rafał Trzaskowski, the candidate of the governing party, he actually made a big play of the fact that he didn't believe that Poland's very generous child benefit system should be extended towards Ukrainians unless they were actively contributing to the Polish economy, so not as a matter of right. Mr. Nawrocki's take on this has been to argue that in terms of access to public services, Poles should get priority. Okay, this is not something that's directed explicitly against Ukrainians, but de facto, given that this is the largest migrant community in Poland, that's who it's directed against. And as I say, this maps onto changes in public attitudes, which have changed quite a lot. I think the one area where they probably haven't changed is most Poles still think that Ukrainian children should have complete free access to Polish education. There's still very clear majorities in favour of that. But beyond that, in terms of providing the kind of support, welfare benefits, and that there was overwhelming support for at one time, that's changed.
Professor, we're just about out of time, but I do want to ask you a final question. Will relations with the U.S. change as a result of the results of the presidential election? And what about the EU and Poland?
So the president doesn't make foreign policy. That's the government that makes foreign policy. But the president can have an important influence on foreign policy, partly because they have this huge mandate, but and particularly in security areas, because the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces and therefore can insert themselves in debate on security issues. The current government has had a very problematic relationship with the Trump administration. Donald Tusk described Donald Trump as a Russian security service asset, which obviously makes for difficult bilateral relations. Mr. Nawrocki, on the other hand, has excellent relations with Donald Trump. He had a visit to the White House, to a photo opportunity in the Oval Office during the campaign where Mr. Trump held his thumbs up and said, you'll win, which turned out to be a good call. So I think there's a kind of big difference there between the attitudes of the government and the attitude of Mr. Nawrocki. Incidentally, I should also say that ambassadors have to be appointed with the president's consent. And currently, Poland doesn't have an ambassador to the United States because Karol Nawrocki, his predecessor, Andrzej Duda, blocked the government's appointment. Bogdan Klich, a former Civic Platform defense minister, and Mr. Nawrocki's made it clear he won't accept this. Mr. Nawrocki doesn't want Poland to leave the EU, like the Law and Justice Party. He's not a kind of hard Eurosceptic. He doesn't want Polexit. However, he has a very different attitude towards how Poland should advance its interests within the EU, particularly the extent to which it should work or clash with the major EU powers, France and Germany. And also, he's hostile to too deep European integration. And here, I think, and this links in with the question about the US, attitudes towards security are really important because he's strongly opposed to the development of any European defense identity outside of working through the NATO structures, basically outside of the transatlantic alliance. The government is much more open to this. It's much more open to the idea of a separate European security architecture. I mean, everyone in Poland wants EU countries to increase their defense spending to the 5% nearly that Poland enjoys. But there's a big difference between whether this should be a separate EU defense identity or whether this should only be through the transatlantic alliance. I think there's a big difference. And the fact that Mr. Nawrocki won and made it clear that he did oppose that particular sort of European integration will make it difficult for the government to pursue European security policies outside of the NATO framework, solely as within the EU framework.
Professor Szczerbiak, thank you so much for joining us today on Krynycja.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
I have been speaking with Professor Alex Szczerbiak, Professor of Politics at the University of Sussex in the UK, who is also an analyst on the Polish political scene. This episode of Krynycja has been produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. And I'm Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynycja. Until next time, that's all for now.